Hello and welcome again to church history class. And we are going to pick up where we left off. And we're going to begin discussing about the sub-apostolic age, uh, from there to the Old Catholic Church, which is also known as the early church fathers. We're going to look at the problems that kind of existed at that time. There's going to be a lot of things that we will cover, and even though this is a 5 week course, there are several things that to get up into the period where Reformation takes place, takes effect. There we will see actual Reformation that will come about as as a precursor to what will be the formal Reformation time, or the Reformation movement, which is about the 1500s. So that being said, we got to cover 15 centuries worth of church history and do it in 5 weeks. Now, you might say, well, you can probably get by with 3 centuries per class. That may be true and well of itself, but being how we speed up our classes to get our students their education faster, we have associated ourselves into kind of the highway, a little bit above 55 into the 70-mile zone. So we're going to go ahead and move forward. What we're talking about here, week 2, we're talking about the sub-apostolic age. We're going to begin there, and we're going to start somewhere around the early 60s. When I say 60s, I'm talking about the year 60. This is year 2000 plus. We're talking about actual 60 being the year. Each generation is, when we think about 60s or 70s, 80s, 90s, depending on when you were born or when you are living, or the time that you approach or hit adulthood, you think of those things when we refer to the 60s. So for some, you may want to regard to the Beatles and Elvis Presley and these things, and that would be what we would consider the 60s. But when we consider the 60s of the church history, we're speaking more of a grounding, foundational aspect of our past. Talking about the apostles, the what many would call, and I try to be very fair in considering very many positions where people have taken or gravitated to, where they are on their walk with Christ. Never pretended to know anything except that be of Christ and Him crucified, but with the knowledge that God has given us opportunity to learn. As we learn, we have to give an account for those things. So, to consider the apostles as being their own entity, or being their own person, or being, just an era of time, meaning that in some cases, some believe that apostles are not for us today, that there are no more apostles. Well, we're not here to speak doctrine as far as man-made doctrine or ideas or beliefs. What we hear in church history is to describe as exactly what took place. You cannot change history. The second century it was at one time known or described as a tunnel period in the history of Christianity. The imagery is actually more apt for the last 1/3 of the first century. The absence of a narrative comparable to the book of Acts for this period leaves many gaps in our knowledge of what took place. Many historical books have been written and taken effect that we have studied over the course of time. We have to resort, however, to some hypothesis. We have to come into some sociological theories in order to describe the developments of this church during this period. For example, the apostles Paul and Peter and James, the brother of Jesus, they are also known as the Big Three of the Apostolic Church. And they were all killed within 5 years of one another in the mid-60s. So this is the time period that we're going to begin with. James, for example, was killed by the Jerusalem authorities at a time when a Roman governor had died and his successor had not yet arrived, and that was at 62 AD. Peter and Paul, on the other hand, the other two-thirds of that big three, they were executed both under Nero in around 64 AD. So at about this time, we're talking at least within 5 years for sure, that these big three, they were removed from the apostolic age. Combined with the suppression of the Jewish revolt that happened in Palestine against Roman rule in 66 to 73 AD, the resulting of the destruction of Jerusalem itself, all of this brought a very significant new situation to the church in the last third of the first century. Now, there were strands of Jewish Christianity that was going on in the late first century and even in the second century that they saw an increased alienation of believers in Jesus from the synagogues. One major important result of the Apostle James to be described was the destruction of the temple in approximately 70 AD. And this caused a banishment of the Jews from Jerusalem after the Bar Kokhba revolt, is what it is known for, in 135 AD, and was the removal of Jerusalem as a geographical center of the Christian movement. The very terminology Jewish Christianity has, at this time, when we're talking about in the time we're discussing, had become a very problematic and even sometimes used to cover all Jewish influences on Christianity, and even sometimes Christianity among those ethnically Jews. The term was used, the Jewish Christianity. This term was used narrowing, was lowly and become interwoven with the Gentiles, of the Gentile church as being viewed heretically because of the influence of Jewish customs that were being enforced upon believers. A mutual rejection, therefore, of each other then became an event that would cause little literature from the Jewish Christianity being written. And this is why there was very serious broad strokes or gaps that are during this time in the history of the church. And this is also because very small pieces of literature has survived that time. Now, it would be Eusebius, the 4th century church historian, who would report that during the Roman-Jewish War of 66 to 70 AD, that Christians in Jerusalem took flight to Pelia across the Jordan River. Now, although the reports of the historian's writing has been brought into question in some degrees, possibly elements of it may not be totally accurate when you consider the plethora of information, which is very minute, really. There must be some acknowledgement of those Christians that seemingly took flight, for they were recorded as returning after the war. Now, that we do have records of. Many synagogues, by the end of the first century, took actions that effectively eliminated from their membership any Christian presence that may be or had been continued. Jewish Christians found themselves excluded from these worship places they had known in the past, and they didn't even accept Gentile Christians. Now, when Rome forbid Jews from Jerusalem after 135 AD, the Palestinian church itself became largely Gentile as a result. And there were 3 strands of Jewish Christianity, or what we call Jewish branches, or Jewish Christianity branches, have been attested in early writings of the church fathers. Now, all are known only in a pragmatic speculation, but the Ebionites, this was a group of Jewish Christians most commented on by Gentile Christian writers, and they were treated as heretical. Their hero was James the Just, and they were quite antagonistic toward Paul. In fact, they took the position that Gentile converts must submit to the law of Moses. Early church fathers offer that their name came from who they followed, a man by the name of Ebion. That's Ebion, Ebion. That Hebrew name comes from the word meaning poor. They were seen in relation to that name that were theologically poor, and spiritually they were in poverty. And they held a very low view of Jesus' nature as being only human. Now, there was another group, and they are called the Nazarenes. Now, these were the Jewish Christians, although they themselves lived by the law of Moses, yet they accepted Gentile believers without expecting them to submit to the law. This was uneasy, very, very unstable middle ground, and which failed to draw as much comment from the Gentile writers. This begins to show us how biased some were, even in those early times of the church, and how arrogancy was even then beginning to creep its ugly head into the boundary zones of what may have come to be today. The third group was the Elkossites. The Elkossites, these were Jewish Christians who would absorb Gnostic tendencies, and we'll cover that here in a little bit. They were the prophet, they followed under the prophet named Elkezai, and he is connected with a book of Revelations that originated in the early years of the 2nd century. The Cologne Mannai Codex relates that Mannai, the 3rd century founder of the Manichaeism, grew up in an Elkossite community, and so establishes a link between its ideas and the later developments in Gnostic thought that's associated with Mannai. Now, Jewish Christianity and its abbreviations, these all were made their strongest impact in Syria. It is important to note that because of the later influence it had in that area, and is affecting the world even to this very day, that in that early land of Syria, the early development there in that region of a priestly concept of ministry may be a direct inheritance from Judaism. The asceticism of the Syriac church, which might have been seen un-Jewish, which was perhaps the mediation from Jewish sectarian groups like those known from Colossus and represented by Essenes and the Jewish Christian groups. Much later, we would see Muhammad, who seemed to have had contact with these very same groups and gained some of his knowledge of Christianity from Jewish Christian groups. In fact, if you were to really start to negate and review and look very solemnly and soberly into the Muslim religion, that of Islam, you will begin to see so many similarities between that which is of Islam and that which is Jewish. In fact, all of the Arab nations find their way, as far as genetically, all the way back to Abraham, because it's Abraham's other son, not Isaac. It would be Ishmael who would become the father of the Arab nations. And from that group, you can see where a lot of the Jewish customs, and some of the Jewish customs even have their roots back to Chaldees, but we won't get into that right now. We're talking about church history. Now, there was literature that was printed or made to print upon different types and forms of writing that has survived, but the literature itself and the problems that have influenced or has instituted itself within the Gentile Christianity, we need to cover a little bit. As little literature that has survived the Jewish Christian groups, in contrast, there are considerable amounts of writings from the Gentile Christian groups in the late first century on to the middle and second century. This literature is seen from the Apostolic Fathers, and this is where we're going to begin with our study, and it reflects the perennial Christian concerns and problems, and so prepares for the further unfolding of the church's story in various subsequent centuries. These Apostolic Fathers can be listed in there. I have a few of them in your notes. Didac, Barnabas, First and Second Clement, Hermas, Ignatius, Polycarp. There's Papias. These all are, and from where they are and what they have affected as far as the literature is in your notes. But this is talking about from 100, Didac being 100 AD, even Barnabas, which is about 97, and it goes to about 135 AD. And you can read upon them at your leisure. We need to move on into the apocryphal literature, because it's going to be here where we start and begin to see certain things that take shape that we would want to say should not have taken shape. But had not these things had come to fruition, or had they not seen their due diligence, so to speak, we would not have a lot of our serious and reality fundamentals of beliefs now today. So we got to kind of see where things kind of go wrong. For example, if I say that we're going to take our written test come a certain date, and I give you 100-question test. If I give you 100-question test and tell you only to answer the even numbers, and I say, but do not answer the odd, only answer the even number on your test. Well, you will find out that if you answered all of them, okay, and you got all of the odd correct, and yet you got all of the even right too as well, you've only half passed the grade because you were not told to answer the odd. If you look at it in that format, another way you can look at it is, if I tell you to answer all of the even and you only answer only the odd, you are 100% incorrect. To follow suit means that you have to see where things go wrong. You have to be able to look back and see, I made a passing grade, but yet I could have made 100 grade had I done this. You might have been 100% right on your answers, but you were 100% wrong on the test. So that being said, we have to look at the mistakes that were made in our church history. If one wants to appreciate the genuine articles, the genuine parts, then you have to read the imitations as well. If one feels a decline of spiritual power, then there is a plunge that can be made into much of the second century New Testament Apocrypha. In fact, there is seemingly an interest into this literature, even today more so, seems like, and this is in due part to the very ignorance of history, the purposes of the literature. We want to read the literature and we want to make it to be apparatus to our beliefs. But when you look at it for what its context is, or what it was, or why it was written, then a lot of untruths that we don't want to appreciate, or untruths we don't want to adhere to, we have to look back and save face and make, and sometimes even lie. Well, I really didn't believe that anyway when I read it the first time, or something. We have to, there's things that we have to do in order to cover up. The truth is that if we can accept from history where we went wrong, we can understand a better future, because we won't worry about repeating what we made in our mistakes in our past. So today, though, however, there seems to be an ongoing interest into many of these Gnostics idealisms that have taken place in the past. And a lot of doctrine has come about because of it, as due in part of Some person, for example, would want to believe that every single person is going to survive this earth and everybody is going to make it to heaven. No matter what you do, no matter what life you live, no matter what fundamentalisms that you believe or choose to believe, or which ones that you rather would choose to ignore. The fact is that not everybody will make it to heaven. That's a fact. The other fact is that there are many who want to say, well, to think that God will not send anybody to hell. God's not sending nobody to hell. They send themselves to hell. And if you don't believe that, the very mere fact that God is seeking to destroy us. Boy, that's a bold statement. And before you turn and click this off, listen to me what I'm going to express to you. The Bible simply says, for the wages of sin is death. Everyone has to die. To look at the blood of Christ and to review the blood of Christ, that is a way to be saved from our sins. Our sins are real. The wages of sin is death. There is not one person on this planet who has not seen death, and there's not one person on this planet currently now who is not going to see death unless a certain event takes place. Now, I'm not going to go into etymological views. I'm simply going to say that there are realistic points of interest that we must understand. The fact is that when God comes and a reckoning has to happen, when the day comes and our breath is breathed our last, the very last breath that we take in our lungs, and from that point on, we must take on death. Now, there is another death that happens as a result. Either the blood has been applied and we have accepted that, or then we don't accept it and the blood is not applied. You have to physically apply the blood. The blood is related to Passover. Passover, boy, I'm getting off subject here. The Passover is simply that which is the first or outer court relationship to that of God. Passover is the outer court. Pentecost is the sanctuary or the second court, and the feast of tabernacle is the last or the holy of holies. It's in those regions that we find ourselves. And let me try to amend this to our study. If you simply believe in only a portion of truth, then you haven't accepted the entire truth. I can go to church every day. I can say a scripture every day. I can literally go to church and pay a tithe if I am so inclined to do so. If I am living a life of what everybody seems to be good, meaning I don't cheat on my wife, meaning I don't lie, I don't steal, I don't murder. If I live that type of life, all of that productive living will not inherit me the kingdom of heaven. I will not arrive at my final destination, which is eternal living with God. Because if I don't accept it, if I don't apply the blood, the Passover, they took and slain the animal, excuse me, and they applied the blood to the three sections of the door trim, if you please. Upon that door rim or the outside of the door, that meant that that person had applied the blood of Christ, or in our case, that's what that would be referring to. And in our three-dimensional aspect of our being a spirit possessing a soulish mind living in a fleshly body, we have applied that principle of the true Lamb of God upon our lives. If we reject that, that means we don't have that application applied to the doorpost. If the application is not there, then that means that the death angel can still come in and still enter in. And it was by the firstborn who died. Pharaoh didn't take on the blood stain. His firstborn died. Many of people lost firstborn children that day because the blood was not applied. There is going to come a wailing again because the blood would not be applied for someone who totally rejects God, who says, I'm not going to have anything to do with him. And to take that and curl that and say, I'm dead set. I know that there's some type of higher form, but I don't choose to want to reckon with it. In fact, I don't think I want to have anything to do with it. When we get to that point in life, you have rejected God the Father, you have rejected his Christ, and you are in total degeneration mode. You are on your way to a position of ultimate death or second death, which means you're oblivion. You are going to be obliviated. It's over. I don't have time to go into all that, this course. But I will say that there are some people who believe that everybody's going to make it. And you can believe all that all you want to. The truth is still truth. And there were many who believed so many different things, like what we just discussed. There were some people who believed that Jewish Christianity, that there were some of the three sects that was of that time back in the first century that truly believed that you believed in this right here, but you also had to adhere to the law of Moses. Or if you didn't, you had to still believe, and you didn't really necessarily have to apply the law of Moses. But then there are some beliefs that you had to just believe and not even paying any attention to the law of Moses. There were so many diverse things that had taken place, but as a result of these certain fundamental ideas that progressed in the mindsets of the early Christian church, certain reforms took place, certain formations of beliefism took place. There were certain ideologies that took effect. And of those ideologies were certain things that was heretical. Now, these are called Gnostics. Gnostics were just those thinking of the mind. They just thought. They truly wanted to and pursued. I believe not every Gnostic was, even though a lot of their messages were heresies, I don't believe that they themselves were just a heretic. Now, I also believe that many of these, if not a majority, truly loved God, and they really wanted to find out more of God. And yet the problem was that they had no foundations. The good news about this class for you is that what I'm going to present to you is something that cannot be changed, called history. History is a fact. We can't change what happened. We may want to dismiss it. We may want to discharge it. We may want to take it away. So that if it's out of sight, it's out of mind. But you cannot change its relevancy. If we go to Mount Rushmore and never clip a tree or never worry about any of the foundational groundskeeps ever again, before long, at some point in time, somebody's going to stumble across and go through some trees and come up to this great big mountain and see those four faces carved into the very rock of that mountain. And they're going to have questions, and they're going to want to know. If we never taught about Mount Rushmore ever again in our classrooms, if it was never spoken of again, the fact that that is still there, made into the bedrock of that mountain, that the fact that it cannot be changed, or you might chisel it off, but there'll be something remains of it left to see. You'll be able to see something, some remnant of it. And a question will come up. I wonder what that was for. I wonder why they did that. What was their purpose? How come they chiseled this face and this face and this one, but didn't choose some of the other faces? What was their mindset? What was the context? That is the premise of Gnosticism and understanding what it alludes to. Gnosticism are those who are really trying to, I believe, pursue truth, but yet they have come to a portion of their lives to where they have mixed and matched because of not having foundations. For the person who centuries later finds those carvings engraved upon Mount Rushmore, they too, if they have never been taught, if it's never been spoken of, hopefully some type of literature, book, or something, or information crested would come up, and somebody would be able to find out why, and why did they choose those four, and that information would come up as well. History cannot be blotted out. It can be forgotten, it can be dismissed, but it cannot be erased. You cannot erase history. There are many who believe that if they were to eradicate and dispose of anything that has to do with the Civil War, that this country would seem to get better because it wouldn't have that negative thought back that happened way back in the certain day. And then if we can kind of somehow get rid of the things that took place in the early 50s and 40s, the fact that somebody was very racist towards another type of race that wasn't their own. The fact that that even took place is very sad indeed, but it's still a truth that you cannot destroy. You cannot erase it. It really happened. As a result, somebody was treated very ill and very wrongfully done against them, and they passed on to their generation behind them, and upon the generation following that, and upon the generation following that. And before long, a mindset was to be created. The mindset is that we are to disapprove and dislike and dissociate ourselves with anybody that is of that race, because of that's just how I was raised, just how I was taught. And when you are done so, when you are taught that, then you are now a victim. But if you don't correct it, if you do not see the error and make the correction to the error, then you will continue that error, and it will grow and grow and grow, and the error will become big, and a snowball effect will take a hold. And the next thing you know, you got a mess at the bottom of the mountain. That's what Gnostics were. Gnostics were those who had certain pinpoints of accuracy, and they took that accuracy and they changed it and they manipulated it because they had nothing to associate it with for truth. So they supplemented something, the idea of truth, or what they believed to be truth, and that became a non-truth. And if you mix truth with non-truth, it's not true. Truth just mixed with non-truth cannot be true. Truth in and of and by itself is and only will be truth. So history cannot be changed. Those who are of the Gnostic realm were exactly that. And these apocryphal literature writings that of the early church, in some cases they were seemed to be written for like entertainment, and even to satisfy even some curiosity. Others were more serious works of edification. Some advocated asceticism and certain doctrinal ideas and thoughts. All of the apocryphal writings are valuable. I'm not going to say it's not. They're valuable for reflecting. They're valuable to prevent, at that time of their compositions, they were valuable to them. And some of the New Testament apocryphas of the second century are as well, has some good information in it. And it's not that they are like heretic or heresy. Some of it is, but not all of it is. But to say somebody writes something that is not founding or is not truth, it doesn't mean that person themselves is not truth, or that them themselves are false. It's the fact that what they have has become false. For example, some of the apocryphal writings of the second century were like the Gospels of Thomas, which is probably the earliest biblical writing ever discovered, the Gospel of Peter, and there was the Proto-Evangelium of James. Boy, that's a big word, but yes, that's another one. That was of what we call the Gospels format or writings. There were the Acts of Peter, the Acts of Paul, the Acts of Andrew, the Acts of John. There was an epistle type of what was called the Epistle of the Apostles. There was another apocalyptic, writing that would be the Apocalypse of Peter. That was one that was like Revelation of what John did. There were other writings like the Ascension of Isaiah, the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, the Sibylline Oracles, the Odes of Solomon, the Book of the Laws of the Land. All these were writings that were accepted by Orthodox Christianity, like Clement, Ignatius, Polycarp, but they have been criticized and represented severely because of their works and the result of the falling away from apostolic Christianity. From when we get away, I mean, listen to what Paul said: "Who has bewitched you from the simplicity that's in Christ?" So there are those that was writing things. The Epistle of John was written primarily to combat Gnosticism of the day. Um, these were not simple-minded people now who wrote these things, as many have tried to make them out to be. The unusual charge of the apostolic fathers retreated from the robust doctrines of grace and faith, the enunciated by Paul, who took refuge on a more moralistic and a legalistic type terminology. But these were just simply these writings that came upon our church history, and we have to understand that these were, even though many of them that have been proven to be false, is when we say false, in other words, what we call today is proving things to be factual, fact checking certain ideologies. Every time you hear today anything somebody brings up, some type of saying or some type of whatever they're discussing or speech they're giving, a lot of fact checking goes on to say, well, they really said this, but the truth is that something else was true. So we have to understand that not everybody's going to be perfect. There's going to be something here that I'll even say, no doubt, that you're going to say, no, I don't like that. I didn't like that. Excuse me. I don't like that. I didn't like that. Just because you don't like something, in fact, again, church history is something you can't change. I can't change what is true. I have to only present it to you, and you have to say, you have one of two choices. Either you can choose to not believe it and say, that's just his story, but where's the evidence? Well, that's the thing about it. History has evidence. There is something that we have to go to now to discuss as part of the church and the empire being Rome. There were attitudes back then towards Christians. The relationships of the early church with the Roman Empire, it constituted one of the major themes in the early church and Christian history. The relationships of Christianity with the civil government, constituted in later centuries, would be a key issue. And even to this very day, the separation of church and state in America. The situation in the first century was complex, though. It moved from a period of uneasiness and uneasy contacts to a time of local persecutions and the empire-wide influence and persecution against such Christians. In the book of Acts, the government did not distinguish Christians from Jews. The religion was a legally recognized one. The presence of Christians had been the association and the occasion of a disturbance in Rome back in 49. During the reign of Claudius, who expelled the Jews from the city, and that's in Acts 18:2. And because of the agitation over Chestus, or Crestus, I think is how you pronounce his name, the situation changed at all under Nero. Now, he was responsible for the great fire that destroyed much of Rome, and that was in 64 AD. Yet he charged and punished the Christians for the fire. Tacitus, who is a Roman historian, we still have his stuff today, reported that the incident as such in his annals that considered Christians as a deadly superstition. Nero's officials apparently took action against the Christian group, not individuals, on account of that name. Christians were now represented and recognized by the authorities of Rome as distinct from Jews. Therefore, the persecution under Nero was confirmed to Rome. But this action then sent a precedent that could be followed by others elsewhere. Domitian of 81 to 96 was remembered in Christian writings as the next persecuting emperor. Domitian, although little external confirmation reveals that he acted against certain high ranking individuals, but it is known that some of them followed and adhered to some of the Jewish customs. So it may have been a political reason why he did not go against everybody individually as all, but yet still many distinct actions were recorded in history that troubled the Christians in like the province of Asia during his reign. There was the reign of Trajan from 98 to 117, which provides important evidence concerning the legal status of Christianity, and for that purpose must be returned to a below position kind of person. Trajan continued the policy that made Christians punishable for that name, in that he followed the precedent that was founded by the Druids. It was the Druidism belief that when it was suppressed, even though it was suppressed in Gaul because of their human sacrifice, and this caused many great shameful activities to take place against Christians. Now, what was so big about that? Well, because the relationship that they had, Druids back then, Druids had human sacrifice involved. And so they looked at the sacrifice, or the language now, the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross, being sacrificed for the sins of all mankind. That mindset took over, and so Druidism it made them to look, Trajan look at Christians just like he looked at Druids, where human sacrifice was being made to please some god. Okay, then it would be Hadrian in 117 to 138 AD, whose response to popular tumults that forced magistrates to follow mob-like demands and sought to regularize proceedings to the law courts, and in fact reaffirmed the policies of Trajanism. Following was Marcus Aurelius, 161 to 180 AD, you may have heard that name, which became a horrific time in our church history due to the disasters and the misfortunes at different places in the Roman world. Now, early literature hails him in high praise, yet it was under his rule that the persecutions of Christianity began to really, really rise. The wave of this persecution was from 166 to 168. That was kind of the pinnacle. In fact, a large wave of anti-Christian sentiment in 177 AD produced an apologetic, activity. It was what you hear, what we call apologist. It was after a revolt that was led by Avidius Cassius in 175 that was put down, and therefore Marcus Aurelius made a tour of the East in 176. And what took place was customary forms of allegiance would be conducted by sacrificing Christians on behalf of the emperor. The very thing they were pursuing to stop is the very, very thing that they in themselves did. Now, the attitudes of pagans towards Christians came about in severe during this time. Christians were held responsible for various calamities since they did not worship the traditional God, so to speak. Early Christians appeared to be obstinate. The Christian apologists repeatedly responded to the three other charges known as atheism, cannibalism, and incest. And their response was that the charges against Christians were absolutely incredible. So some explanation must be required. For example, atheism is the ancient world as it was practiced. It wasn't. It was practical, um, not theoretical. So back then, an atheist was someone who did not observe the traditional religious practices in the world, regardless of what faith or religion that was being professed. So Christians were getting the blame for them, and the apologists were demanding explanations as to the why. And the charge against Christians regarding these individuals were ridiculous. And Christians were being charged for atheism's non acceptance of traditional gods of that day. They were seen as equal, therefore enemies of the empire, those being pagan, those being Christian. All of them, in the empire's eyes, were one and the same. Then there was the charge of cannibalism. This was derived from the Christian language, as I was discussing, about the Eucharist, eating the body and drinking the blood of Christ. Cannibalism and Christians were seen as to be one and the same. As far as incest is concerned, the other part of that, this was related to Christians. Get this, as they were calling one another brothers and sisters. Well, there must be some incest going on there. These three groups were becoming equated to Christianity in the early time from the early second century. The Roman government and leadership failed to distinguish these types of folks from Christians. Roman officials also had a hard time distinguishing between libertine Gnostics who claimed Christianity and actual Christians. And the early church wrote against heresies that was making it clear, however, that they were writing and speaking, talking about Gnostics, they were writing that they were members of their own Gnostic sects who were guilty of sexual immorality and other charges themselves. Because of Christians keeping themselves removed from normal society and activities of the society surrounding them, it was easy for the officials to relate more readily their aspects of believing of a Christian idolatry from traditional religious mindset of the day, like traditional gods that they would uphold. The contempt of Christians is represented by graffiti. Graffitico is the original word graffiti that was found in Rome. These were drawings that would show a person with an ass's head on a cross, and while his hand raised in tribute alongside with an inscription, Alexamenos worshipped his god. Philosophers like Celsus wrote the first major surviving attack on Christians, it was called the True Word. It was rewritten by Origen, who was later in his work against Celsus. He intellectually showed how they were scorned and despised, and who were viewed as unprofitable members of society. However, to combat this early Christian apologist, they would simply have to call on people to believe and did not engage in rational demonstrations. Origen responded to these attacks in his literature by stating that God prepared the way for Christianity and that he fulfilled prophecy, demonstrating in its truth. The miracles of Jesus were not worked by magic. He connected Jesus' miracles to the moral improvement Jesus brought to humanity and to human life, never using it for personal gain. The incarnation brought a charge in circumstances, but not in nature of the logos or word. The resurrection involves a change, he described, into a higher form of body. The rapid expansion of Christianity would not have been possible without divine assistance, he demanded. The fact that persecution is not a doubt, without a doubt, it was not as constant and as extensive as is often assumed and portrayed, even believed, but it was always present. It was always there. It was always a possibility, in spite of the assertions. It is not so clear of the reason for them, and even though the legal basis to argue against or for, it simply existed. Excuse me. The fact that Christians got off on the wrong foot as far as the Roman authorities was concerned is really the true fact here. It was the correspondence in 112 AD between Pliny the Younger and the governor of Bithynia, the Emperor Trajan, that provides for us a window into the legal situation that sought to persecute the Christians as a whole, not individually. Pliny found three distinct classes among those against whom accusations should be brought: those who had confessed that they were Christians and remained steadfast in that confession, these he ordered to be executed. Or if they were Roman citizens, they were sent to Rome and they were to be beheaded. Those who denied that they were even Christians or had been Christians, these he released, since they recited a prayer to the gods and offered incense and wine to a statue of the emperor. These were the things that Christians they thought could not do. Therefore, a reasonable test it was to determine if they had or were Christians was to prove their loyalty to Rome in doing such. But then those who were apostatized, it was they who had been Christians, and yet they had ceased to be such. They had apostatized 20 or more years ago. Domitian's orders. In other words, Domitian said they had to be apostatized from Christianity for 20 plus years. And it proved it, to prove this, they would have to be worshiping the emperor's image and the statue and the gods and curse Christ. It was from these that Pliny learned more and more of Christianity. In fact, he referred to them as being perverse and extravagant superstitions. Pliny would ask these three questions. Now, check this out. Are any distinctions to be made for age or weakness? Are apostates to be pardoned? Does the punishment attack to the name itself or to the crimes connected with the name Christian? Trajan gave three responses. These two went at each other to determine what it was going to take to deal with these Christians. His response was to the first question, are any distinctions to be made for age or weakness? His response was Christians were not to be sought out, but if accused and convicted, they were to be punished. The second question was, are apostates to be pardoned? No anonymous accusations, he said, were to be received. The third question was, does the punishment attack to the name itself or to the crimes connected with the name Christian? The deniers were to be pardoned. Punishment, therefore, was based on that name Christians itself. As a result of all this persecution, two responses resulted: the apologetics and the martyrdom witnesses, the martyrs. These were the two results or responses that came out of this time of tyranny against Christians. There were also recorded the testimonies of those faithful members who died in testimony to their faith. And these Christians, what they suffered, they resulted in the same as being their response. Now, Christian apologists, as I stated, these were, of course, in the 2nd century now is what we're talking about. The earliest apologist in whole comes from Aristides of Athens, the apologist of that era. Aristides wrote those known by fragments from 117 to 138 during Hadrian's rule was Quadratus, the preaching of Peter, the Aristo of Pelia. These were the fragments. These were the books or the parchments that had survived. And they talked about those things that happened under Emperor Marcus Aurelius. The epistle to Diognetus This was a literature creation. It's very little known about in details, but it was one that was written. Um, the other literatures that took place, all these summarized the apologist exhibition considerable indebtedness to earlier Jewish apologetics. Among the points of which Jewish thinkers pioneered the way for Christian thinkers were their arguments for the greater antiquity of Moses and the scriptures than Greek literature and philosophy, for the borrowing by the Greeks of their good ideas from the Hebrews, and for the superiority of monotheism. Boy, I'm having a hard time talking today. To pagan polytheism, which draws upon many Greek philosophies and thought, and for finally the interpretation of biblical thought in terms of Greek culture. Add defenders of our faith, you add this up together. They answered the popular charges against Christians and made a plea for tolerance. Christians, as they recorded, are really good citizens and pray for the empire. On a deeper note and level, they wrestled with the three fundamental questions that rephrased and still express the scandal of the Christian faith. How can the universality of salvation in one religion that reached back almost 150 years be maintained? The answer would be the connection of Christianity to Jewish scriptures. How can one accept the scandal of the cross, a suffering Messiah, who at the same time is God? The answer would be found in the connection of Jesus with the eternal Word of God and blame the influence of demons for his death. How can the power of demons and paganism and the persecution of Christians be reconciled with the providence of a good God? The answer could only come from there and our appealing to our faith in the victory of Christ. Christ over the demons and the eventual vindication of God's purposes in the second coming of Christ. Excuse me again. It should be noted that apologists were not content with just defense. They took the offensive, attacking the pagan cults themselves, which, by the way, were mythological. They were irrational and often connected with immorality. Moreover, they sought to prove Christianity, and apologists, especially important here, was that the argument from fulfilled prophecy was part of what they presented in their ongoing offense movement. A major difference between the modern world and the world in which Christianity rose is that people today consider the latest to be the greatest and the best, the most recent, truest of all that had been apologetic in their faith. The opposite was true in the Greco-Roman world. The oldest was the best, the truest, and the greatest. In a world that valued antiquity, the apologist argued that Christianity was really not a new religion. It reached way back into the original religions of humanity and was representation and the culmination of God's plan, which was forecasted by his prophets of the Old Testament. They expounded the Christianity faith. Excuse me again. Doctrinally, apologists stressed monotheism and the Creator. Jesus the Christ was the Spirit. He was God. It was the group of that age that pioneered Christian theology. They earmarked an important development in Christian intellectual effort to accommodate cultural appropriation. They used the philosophy of their day to further the Christian purpose. Nevertheless, they represent a new stage in Christian intellect and activity. It would be Tatian, the apologist, who would represent the former approach, and he sought to burn the bridges from the past. He had a teacher named Justin who had taken a different approach from the opposite of his own teacher. Although the future of Christian thought belonged to Justin, it would be the attitude of Tatian that has constituted to be one of the most current among the Christian attitudes to the world and society all around. It was because of him that we see a lot of Gnosticism come about even today. People, for the most part, have sought to look back to history and have tried to identify themselves with something today. Not to say that's wrong. If you take it in its historical fact and its approach, you can decipher what was true and what was not true. Now, the other type of swing that happened as a result of all this persecution that took place was martyrs of the second century and the rise of it. The authentic accounts of martyrdom from the second century, it comes in three literary forms. Now, when I say literary forms, I'm talking like, this book being the book of Acts, and this is a literary form, versus this book here, which is a dictionary of the New Testament theology. I have tons of books in my library, but these are two different types of literature. This one being a dictionary, and this one showing the actions of certain people. Okay, so that being said, there's different types of literature. Now, the second part of this this is the martyrs that took place in the second century. But of them come these different literary forms. Excuse me. There were three of them. One was letters, and these were by churches that described the accompanying events of that martyr. There were passions. Passions is a type of literature that narrates the last days of the martyr. Then there were acts. These were the accounts of recount the trials of the martyr and what they experienced by the authorities or the oppressing agent. You can also, even though they're all historical by nature to us, in that day they were different. Only the Acts or the books of Acts, I ain't talking about the Acts in your Bible. I'm talking about like a historical account, okay, of what took place, an accuracy detail, a journal, if you will. It is not court records or documents like that we have today. It's not that. These events and literature creations survive in writings, these type of writings, and of those who witnessed those events. Now, there are some accounts of and writings of such martyrdoms in literature. Like I said, one is like the letters of churches of martyrdom by Polycarp in Smyrna, the letter of the churches of the Venene and Lyons, the Passions. There was that from Lucius. There was Felicitas. There was his. He's like 203 A.D. They were located in Carthage. There were certain like Acts of Justin, the Acts from Rome, of the Pergamene saints. All these different things that took place, also in Carthage. The idea of martyrdom per se, and all these literature writings, had Jewish precedents in them, but was particularly developed by Christians in the period of persecution. The very word itself in the Greek, word meaning witness, is this word that those that give their lives in persecution are called martyrs. These were those who gave their confessions but were not killed. They were called witnesses. But they're all called witnesses. But their actual name, those who were they're part of the persecution of the martyrs. They gave their confessions, but they didn't get killed. Their title was called a confessor. A theology of martyrdom was early elaborated from this, as was the beginning of this recognized in Ignatius. Since Jesus the Christ was the original martyr, parallelism was developed with Christ, and then often worked out in the accounts of those liturgical compositions. The salient points out to in the theology of martyrdom may be expressed by some basic motives. The most basic is that they being a witness. This phrase reoccurs often in those manuscripts when the martyr stated, "I am a Christian." And they gave their testimony, confessing their witness to their accusers. Now, another motive was that they were um, um, that they were athletic and heroic in facing their opponents. It is not that they were athletes. They're not some kind of a Marvel superhero, but they were talking about their motives. Another motive would have been their supreme form of the sanctity of martyrdom. And because it was a grace not given to all Christians, grace then is another motive. In that day, it was believed that one was chosen to become a martyr. Another form of motive was sharing the suffering and the victory of Jesus the Christ. The Eucharist, as it related to the death of Jesus the Christ, was also another form or motive in their accounts. The Holy Spirit became another form of motive of martyrdom because he was with them till the end. Eschatological ideas played a part in the motive of martyrdom as well. In fact, that this became in the basis of their letters and the letter of their practices of praying for the intercessor of the saints. And finally, baptism was brought in as a motive, that their death brought forgiveness of sins to the martyrs. This was the baptism of blood. This would be referred to often as the bitter cup, and which was drunk by them. It was there that something we can take away, that from this, in spite of some defections, the persecutions became a strengthening instead of a crushing of the church. Their resolve became another believer's devotion. But there were heresies and schisms in the second century that developed, and all this played a part. Up until this point, we have studied the external problems facing the church in the second century: opposition from the state and from the synagogue. Now, on the next part, when we pick up here in a minute, on your next video, we will turn inside and review the issues and the problems that faced the church while it was drawing boundaries of acceptable doctrine and practice. Now, modern usage distinguishes heresy, which is false doctrine, from schisms, which is division over personalities and disciplines and practices where fundamental doctrinal error is not involved. This is what apologists would do. We're going to get into that deeply on the second video, but this will conclude the first video for week 2, and we'll pick up here. Thanks.